You have now created a new, larger, more powerful God that sits above God and gives God rules that God has to follow. And these are the substitutionary models. And there are a few strains here, so we'll talk about them all together. The direction is started by Anselm of Canterbury, who died in 1109 of the Common Era. And Anselm doesn't actually use the term substitution, he uses the term satisfaction. But his big innovation is that it's not the devil God has to contend with, it's not even us really, it is God's self. Because God is offended by sin, and God's honor needs to be satisfied. Now, if that language sounds weird, that's because that comes very much from feudal European life. In fact, that's exactly how Anselm pictures God, like a literal lord or a baron who is offended by the peasants who sully his personage. And so Anselm wonders about this. How could a peasant ever make their mistakes up to a lord? And ultimately he decides they can't, which is why we need a God-man, a divine human person, a Jesus who can satisfy God's stained honor. Now later, this would become substitutionary atonement. Jesus takes our place to bear the weight and the consequence of sin when no one else can. And then even later in the Reformation period, around the 1500s, it becomes penal substitutionary atonement. Jesus takes our place to bear the penalty of sin that God demands. And for a lot of people who have primarily been exposed to evangelical expressions of Christianity, that last one is perhaps, for some of us here today, the only way we have ever heard atonement articulated clearly. On the cross, Jesus appeases the demands of an angry God. The technical word for this is propitiation. However, this is where we find ourselves chasing our tail a little bit. Because if you remember, the main reason that this family of theories developed was because theologians like Anselm and Abelard realized that God being God, God didn't need to overcome any obstacles. God doesn't negotiate with devils. God doesn't need to defeat death. God can do as God pleases. I mean, that's sort of the whole point of being God. And yet, in expressions of penal substitutionary atonement, you will hear things like, well, God didn't want to kill God's son, but God had to in order to satisfy justice. Or you might hear, God cannot forgive unless there is a sacrifice. The problem, of course, is that as soon as you say God cannot, it doesn't matter what comes after that. You have now created a new, larger, more powerful God that sits above God and gives God rules that God has to follow. Not only that, you also at least run the risk of making it sound like Jesus and God are at odds with each other in the cross, rather than the perfect loving community we know of as God working in partnership through the cross. And when you pit Jesus and the Father against each other, you are never going to be representative of a God who is divine communal love by nature. Now, it's important to understand where penal substitutionary atonement comes from historically. The earlier expressions of substitutionary atonement make a lot of sense to me. Jesus takes our place in bearing the weight and the consequence of our sin. We see exactly what our violence looks like when we look at the cross. That is, I think, a very important way that the Bible does speak of atonement. But in the Reformation period, along with a lot of change religiously, you also have a profound political shift that is happening alongside. The church is breaking away from the Pope and divine fiat leadership. That's the Reformation. But at the same time, Europe is also breaking away from monarchical divine fiat leadership. And so all across Europe, nations are replacing kings and queens with modern nation states. And as soon as you do that, you have to figure out how you're going to set rules for society. Because previously, the rules were whatever the king said. But now you get legal frameworks that are developing where everyone is expected to play by the same rules, at least in theory. It doesn't always work that way. But that becomes our theological lens during this period as well. We really start to imagine God and sin and salvation through the lens of a courtroom, because those are now essential to society in a way they haven't been before. And that can be a fine metaphor for thinking about God, but like all metaphors, it breaks when it is stretched too far.